All right, we are back. It is early morning over here. I'm just waking up, but I was been watching this video interview with Bernardo Castro over the last few days. 4.5 hour video. I think I have like four parts to it up already, but they've been talking about illusionism and all this sorts of interesting things. So far, the interview's a bit hit or miss. I'm a big fan of Bernardo's work. Analytic idealism is a view I think is worth taking seriously. I'm not such a big fan of the way he interacts with his opponents, so it's a little bit disappointing. But whatever. So nonetheless, I was interested in seeing what they had to say about this stuff with Sean Carroll, because I noticed that Sean Carroll's been talking about zombies lately, the physicist. I had Sean Carroll on Space Time Mind a long time ago, and we talked about some stuff, but we didn't talk about consciousness too much, surprisingly. So it was interesting to see Sean Carroll have some views about zombies. He even cited a paper of mine, my deprioritizing the a priori arguments paper, which I was surprised I saw come around through the grapevine, that citation. I was like, huh, interesting. But I'm not exactly sure what he's trying to say. So I figured, let's go look. Um, uh, the paper he wrote behind a paywall, unfortunately, on the Journal of Consciousness Studies. I'm not a big fan of their business model, but I understand everyone's trying to make money. Okay, anyway, so I figured I'd watch this. I know there was a debate, I think it happened last year. I was in the middle of writing my book. I wasn't paying too much attention to the outside world, so I didn't really catch this. But I know it's a debate between Goff and Carroll, so I wanted to check it out. I'm not really interested in hearing Philip talk about his same spiel again. I've heard it a million times. I'm more curious about and I'm not trying to dismiss Philip's work. I think Philip's work is interesting too, although I guess I'm a little bit of a hater when it comes to his work. But anyway, nonetheless, let's go ahead and see what Carroll has to say. I'll talk about Philip's work some other time.
All right, is my microphone on? Is that working? So there are people out there, as you've just seen, who think that the difficulties we have in understanding consciousness should lead us to dramatically alter our best picture of physical reality. I think this is a bad idea. And look.
So first of all, I know Sean's gonna misunderstand panpsychism. I'm not on board with misunderstanding views. So I think he neglects the idea that Philip doesn't want to change any physics. He just wants to answer them at the fundamental level. Everything at the level of mathematics will stay the same according to Philip. So this is not the most interesting attack.
Maybe it's right. It's certainly possibly right. But just a priori, our understanding of physical reality is incredibly good. Individuals might lack in perfect understanding of physical reality, but as a species, we know an awful lot about it. Because it's very simple. The rules are remarkably graspable, whereas consciousness would be your first suggestion for something we don't yet understand. It's an emergent phenomenon from 86 billion neurons and the many, many more connections between them. Of course, that's hard to understand. Our lack of perfect understanding about that should not lead us to question our best picture of physical reality. It's like you're doing a math homework, you hand in your math homework, and the professor says, I think there's a mathematical mistake here between line 3 and line 4. And you say, well, have you thought about the possibility that the axiomatic foundations of arithmetic are not as solid as you thought they were? Maybe.
That's not what their panpsychism is doing. I mean, come on.
But I do not recommend that as a strategy for trying to improve your grade.
Yes.
This argument goes way back, obviously, right? Here's Rene Descartes, the dualist.
All right, so if he's going to strawman things this badly, we might have to speed up the audio because I got to get through this somehow. Okay, interactionism, sure.
Who thought that mind and body were completely separate things. And here is his nemesis, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. He sent the manuscript to Princess Elizabeth. He just wanted money. What he got instead was correspondence saying, this makes no sense. Why? Because you're saying that the mind is completely immaterial, doesn't even have a location in space. So tell me how it interacts with the body. It's not even located anywhere. How is it that my mind, which I think makes decisions and gives my body instructions, where does that interaction happen? And Descartes made an attempt. He drew pictures of the pineal gland. Maybe that was the radio receiver in the brain that gets messages from the mind. No one even back then was convinced by this. And of course, so now, people who want the mind to be something other than physical have much more sophisticated and nuanced and delicate versions of this kind of approach that is not purely physical. But we have another option now that works much better, namely
So that's interactive dualism. It's not as popular as it once was, but there still are people who endorse interactive dualism. I'm not really sure what the argument against it there was supposed to be from Sean, but except for just to be like, it's bad, okay? But maybe it's bad, maybe it's not. It depends on your views of causation, and it's really complicated. But anyway, all right, let's...
And the trick in physicalism to make sense of consciousness is what is called weak emergence. The idea is that the world appears to us in layers or levels. There are multiple vocabularies, multiple ways of describing the world that work equally well, even though they're describing different levels of precision and coarse graining. So you have the classic example of a successful application of this comes from the 19th century and the success of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. We say we have a box of gas, there's some molecules in it. You can speak the language of the molecules. You can use the vocabulary of the microscopic level. And at that level, the words you use are atoms and forces and momenta and collisions, and you can describe what happens inside the box. There's another way of talking about the gas in the box, what you might call the emergent level, where you talk a completely different vocabulary of gases with volume and pressure and temperature and things like that. And these two ways of talking are describing the same thing. They're completely compatible with each other. They're not in conflict in any way. In this very simple example, you could even derive the emergent description from the microscopic one, but what's important is there is some relationship between them. Even if you can't derive it mathematically, maybe you discover it empirically, that's fine. The thing is you're not putting anything new in at the emergent level. You're just saying that's a different way of talking about the same stuff that's going on at the micro level. So a physicalist is going to say the same thing about consciousness. They're going to say there's a very fundamental level where we're all made of quantum fields and there's Hamiltonians and observables and things like that. But we can also step back a little bit and talk about the biological level where there are in our brains neurons and there's chemistry going on, there's connections and signals that go across synapses. That's another perfectly valid way of talking, completely compatible with the underlying quantum field theory description. And then there's a human scale way of talking where there are agents, right? People with free will. They behave in certain ways. And they also have consciousness. They have impressions. They experience the redness of red. And that entire vocabulary features relationships between these different components. When I'm conscious of the red of the stop sign, I will stop and so forth. And they are completely compatible with the underlying description. It's very important in this whole way of thinking that you not get yourself confused by switching levels in midstream, by saying, you know, I felt pain because the Hamiltonian of the universe had certain operators in it, right? The individual vocabularies are supposed to be...
Give me 30 days and I'll make you go viral on short form. And if we don't get you 1 million views, you don't pay. If you had 100...
Oh, shut up. So I think what he's trying to say is that they're autonomous. He had that on a slide. So don't confuse the levels. I'm not sure what...
level. You ask a question in one level, you answer it in that one level.
Yeah,
you will not
don't
get
go
into trouble.
Okay.
And we have lots of evidence that this basic strategy is on the right track, but let me be very, very quick to admit, I do not know how consciousness works. Whenever I'm up on stages talking about consciousness, number one, it is never my idea. And number two, people always say, why are you up there doing that? You don't know anything about consciousness. So let me reiterate that I don't know anything about consciousness. But I know something about the fundamental nature of reality. So much so that I'm confident that whatever the explanation of consciousness is going to be, someday it will be within that framework. And part of that is because it's not like we're flailing around with nothing to do. If physicalism is true, if that picture I just mapped out for you is on the right track, it's very clear what to do. We have to map out what happens physically in the brain and in the body. Separately, we can map out what happens mentally. We have experiences, we react to them in certain ways, and then we relate them to each other. This is a very successful program so far. This weird-looking picture on the top right is actually a picture of my head. I was sitting there in the MEG, the magnetoencephalograph, and I was being given stimuli, and I was thinking thoughts, and my thoughts were creating little magnetic fields. And these are the observed magnetic fields created by my thoughts, evidence that there are thoughts in my brain, if nothing else. But the point is, this is a very, very primitive example of showing that relationship between a thought you have in your brain and the lower level way of talking about exactly the same thing, the electrochemical processes in the brain. And so this whole...
So this is a bit unfair because this is something that's in common between the panpsychist and the physicalist. They're both going to agree. They're going to find these patterns, correlations. This is not anything interesting.
Whole task of coming up with a way to describe consciousness in these physical terms, we haven't completed it yet or anything like it, but we're very much on the way, and there's plenty of proposals along those directions. It is an active and very promising research program. Somehow, not everyone agrees. So there is what I like to call the satisfaction gap, which I think is the real reason people don't like this physicalist approach, because they just don't like the physicalist approach. They don't quite think it scratches the itches that they have. They are not satisfied that this is answering the questions that they are asking. So an alternative that you might want to consider, as Philip just told us, is panpsychism. The idea that consciousness is everywhere. There's a...
So this way of putting it, if it seems unsatisfying to you and you want to develop alternatives, that's the right approach, I think. instead of saying it's false and they're, it's silly, it's baloney, it's easily refuted, whatever. So, but this is supposed to imply that the rock is conscious. So Philip doesn't think the rock is conscious. He thinks the parts of the rock are conscious, and even Bernardo doesn't think the rocks are conscious. He thinks it's only living things. So there's some straw manning going on here, perhaps.
Image of a conscious rock, and mentality is ubiquitous and underlies everything. Okay, let's consider this. So there's various arguments that have been put forward in favor of this. I want to hit on some of the classics because I love the classic arguments against physicalism, because if you think about them carefully, they all end up being arguments for physicalism.
Maybe this is where we're going to get to the interesting things. Let me slow it down. Okay, so he's going to argue that the zombie argument is an argument for physicalism. Interesting. People have tried this before. So John Perry tried to argue the zombie argument's really looking for epiphenomenalism. So you're only going to accept that there's zombies if you're epiphenomenalist. Chalmers has refuted that, I think, satisfactorily. I tried to argue that you're only going to think zombies are possible if you think we're living in a simulation. I don't know how successful that argument was, but I tried. So people have made this route. We'll see what the substance of this is. For example, my Shambi argument isn't having anything to do with zombies. Shambis are not zombies. And I'm not claiming that we are zombies. I think that we have phenomenal consciousness, the thing that people think is so mysterious. It's the thing I believe most strongly of all my philosophical commitments, is that there's a common sense and obvious thing there that needs to be accounted for. So Shambis are physical creatures that have that and nothing else, no non-physical stuff. So they aren't zombies. So I'm not sure. I'm curious to see how he thinks the zombie argument is an argument for physicalism. The way I sort of think it's going to go is to argue that if you can have all the same functions without consciousness, then it shows that consciousness doesn't do anything or something. I don't know. So that's kind of the standard way of doing this, but I want to see what his actual way of doing it is. So let's go.
So here is Mary the color scientist.
Okay.
The knowledge argument.
Yeah.
The idea is philosophers, bless their hearts, will do terrible torture to their thought experiment subjects, but their thought experiments, they don't need to get IRB approval. So Mary the color scientist is locked in a room with no colors in it, and she's taught all the physical facts about the universe. So she's never seen the color red, but she knows every physical fact about red. And then you imagine they finally let her out, and she can see the color red. She experiences it, and we think that she is learning something new. Therefore, the argument goes, there is some kind of knowledge other than the physical facts, right? She knew all the physical facts, but there was something she didn't know, what it was like to experience the color red. Therefore, what its likeness is not physical. It's something called qualia or something like that. Before you get too impressed with this argument, I will ask you to contemplate the phrase, Mary knows every physical fact about the color red. Are you 100% certain that you completely understand what that phrase means? It is very common in this form of argumentation that you use natural language words, and maybe they're a little fuzzy around the edges about what exactly is being conveyed, and you can kind of trick yourself into a conclusion that is not quite warranted. The right way to analyze this, if you think this is an argument against physicalism, is to say, is there a physicalist explanation for what happens in the thought experiment?
And there are plenty of them. This territory is very well known. There's tons of well-known responses to the knowledge argument. I've already talked about what I think my response should be, but I agree. It is tricky, because what would it mean for Mary to know all the physical stuff? So if you're an identity theorist like me, as I tend to want to be, then you think red is a brain state. Seeing red is a certain kind of brain state, and that's a physical thing. So if she knows all the physical facts about red, the experience, then she should know about its physical basis, because it is a physical fact. So is it question begging to assume that she doesn't know all the physical facts about red? Interesting. Yes, we don't know. I certainly agree that Mary learns something new when she comes out of the room. She learns what it's like for her to see red. She acquires a concept which allows her to think those kinds of thoughts. Like, this is what it's like to see red, and so forth. Or that's what it's like to see red. So I certainly agree with all that, but I don't really see how this is an argument for physicalism. So let's see how he ties this up.
The answer is, of course there is. It's not even like especially hard. When Mary is learning about color in her black and white room, certain neurons are firing in her brain. When she sees red, different neurons are firing, or in a different pattern they're firing. There are red photons impinging on her retina. That's it. That's the entire explanation. There's absolutely nothing incompatible about physicalism to say that what happens in her brain is different when she sees the color red versus when she reads about the color red in a black and white textbook. It is not.
Yeah, but what happens in her brain when she sees a square is different than what happens in her brain when she understands the concept of square. But still, she could know everything about squares without having to look at them. That's the challenge that the Mary argument wants to bring, is to say, sure, something different is going on in her brain. She had different neurons being activated, and she would have known which neurons in advance, perhaps. But why couldn't she have known what it's like for her? So I think in the background, I made a video on this separately, but I think in the background is a debate actually over what it means to know what it's like. So on one camp, you know what it's like only when you're having the experience. So in order for Mary to know what it's like for her to see red, she'd have to be like somehow making herself see red in her black and white room. Whereas on the other side, there's something that, what it's like to see red, you could understand it. According to physicalism, the argument goes, you could understand it without having to be in that experience. Like right now, I know what it's like to see red. I'm not seeing red. Well, there's red curtain there. So what it's like to see purple, whatever. So I'm not seeing any purple right now, very much. Oh, there's some purple. But anyway, you get the point. So the question is, do you know what it's like to see red when you're not actually having a red experience? I would say there is a sense in what you do, but there's also a sense in which you don't. So there's a sense in which to know what it's like to see red requires having the red experience present, and for you to form a concept directly about that. I don't think Mary could have known in her room what it's like to see in red without ever having the red experience, because that's how these concepts are acquired. It has nothing to do with physicalism. It has to do with empiricism. But I've already belabored that point, so let's finish out what he's going to say. So how is this an argument for physicalism? I don't really see where he's going with this, so it's interesting.
In any sense, a challenge to the physicalist understanding. It gets worse for the anti-physicalists because, like I said at the beginning, we know a lot about the physical underpinnings of the natural world. And here I need to be super duper delicate because this is exactly where there's a very strong impulse to not understand what I'm saying and to misconstrue it. So I'm going to try to be very careful. I'm not saying that physics is done. I'm not saying we understand everything. I'm not saying we are close to understanding everything and tomorrow we'll figure it all out. I'm not saying any of those things. I'm saying there are some things that we understand. And it happens to be that included in the things we understand are all of the physical things going on in this room right now that are relevant to our biology and our thinking and so forth. You and I are made of atoms. And those atoms are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons. There are quarks and gluons in the protons and neutrons. There are forces holding them together, the strong force inside the protons and neutrons, the weak force that can change a neutron into a proton, the electromagnetic force that binds electrons to the nucleus. There's a background Higgs field that gives masses to these particles.
Yeah, so I don't like this argument. I like the core theory argument that we know a lot about the ordinary physical world, the physics of it, and how to explain it. So I like that argument. But of course, the panpsychist is going to say these little things here, these quarks, that is consciousness. These are little bits of consciousness. And of course, one thing I would like the panpsychist to account for is this thing that Sean's talking about, how there are these transitions between the particles. One thing I always liked about string theory was it made sense of this. So how do these decays of, you bump something and then it turns into these two things and then that decays into this other thing. And it's like, okay, so how are these particles turning into other particles? Seems sort of very mysterious. String theory gives an answer to that. It's just the same thing vibrating in different ways. And then okay, so it vibrates like this and then it vibrates like that. And that's what you see as this, nuclear force decaying or whatever. So that was always very mysterious to me as a kid. And then when I read about string theory, I was like, okay. So whether string theory is true or not, I don't know, but you could see why it would make sense of that mysterious thing. Panpsychists need to say something, I think, about these transitions between the particles, especially if these particles are conscious. So what does it mean to say that, there's beta decay, or that these fundamental particles are transforming into other particles in terms of like their micro consciousness or whatever. So anyway, I think that is a real challenge that no one's addressed. On the other hand, I don't think that this argument I think he's about to give, which is that you'd have to add something to this and that would mess up the math. You don't have to add anything to it. This is the stuff we're talking about. This describes the way it behaves. The question is, what fundamentally really are these things? And the panpsychist says they're consciousness. So, I mean, I haven't really seen anything here that says the dualist arguments are arguments for physicalism. So maybe this is false advertising, or maybe he's going to get to it. I don't know.
Then there's gravity that pulls everything together. We even have an equation that you can fit on a t-shirt. I know this because you can buy the t-shirt on my website. I have the t-shirt. I didn't wear it. I'm not as good a salesperson as Philip is, otherwise I would have shown you the t-shirt. You can look it up. So the point is, this is called the core theory. Sometimes you get the impression that we understand particle physics but not gravity. It's all there, gravity included in the core theory. And this theory is successful enough to explain every experiment that we've ever done in any laboratory here on Earth. That's pretty good. But it's better even than that. It's not just that we haven't yet seen anything that is in conflict with the core theory. It's that we know if we do eventually see something in conflict with it, which we're very confident that someday we will.
Yeah, they're desperately eager to find something that conflicts with this standard model, what he calls a core theory. But they haven't found it.
It has to be cleverly hidden. In other words, we have an understanding of the ways in which the core theory can fail within the broad framework of modern quantum field theory physics. There's a little plot. It's too small for you to read, but the point is we have quantitative limits on the kinds of particles and forces that might not yet be observed. And those limits are good enough for us to say they're so weakly interacting with us that they're completely irrelevant for biology, for thinking, for consciousness. So,
Oh, come on. Huh? Distressing. Donkey's tail. I don't want to say
as long as you believe the very broadest principles of modern physics, you and I are made of particles whose behavior we understand. And that is a remarkably impressive achievement. So just to drive it home a little bit, there's some dependence here. I want to emphasize that we don't understand everything. We don't even understand most things. We don't understand biology or chemistry or psychology. Plenty of things we don't understand in astrophysics, not even to mention dark matter and dark energy. And for that matter, there might be a fundamental level that we have no clue about right now. But that's okay, because we know enough to say that what is going on in this room right now depends on and can be described by one certain kind of theory, the core theory, that we actually do know. So that puts incredibly tight constraints on what can happen in the world. We don't know everything, but we know some things. This amount of knowledge poses a huge dilemma for the panpsychist. So I've written this dilemma in very big letters because I don't want anyone to kind of ignore it. Panpsychists, I would say.
Oh, that's big letters for a big mistake.
Tend to ignore this dilemma. Philip kind of gestured toward it in his opening talk, but they would rather not address it. And the dilemma itself is very simple. Any specific version of panpsychism or anything that says something other than pure physicalism must choose between saying the core theory is not quite right.
So obviously they don't change the core theory. So what's supposed to be the problem?
And we have to change it, or the core theory is fine. I claim, using principles of logic taught to me by Aristotle, that those are the only two choices. Your theory of panpsychism is either changing the behavior that we know about from particle physics, or it's not. Those are the only two choices. If you're ever dating a panpsychist, ask them this question. It's okay if they choose the first option. It's okay if they choose the second option. The only thing not okay is if they refuse to answer and they equivocate and they change the subject. Red flag. Swipe left. Go on, okay? But if they do choose one option or the other, they're still in trouble. They get a second date, but I wouldn't commit too early. So let's say that you say, okay, we will change. We'll bite the bullet. We will change the core theory. You know, good luck with that. I'm not against it. This is what physics is all about. This is what we pay people to do. So you are absolutely encouraged to think about how to change that equation. The way that you would need to change it is to say that electrons, for example, behave differently in a brain than they do in particle physics experiments.
Yeah,
that is conceptually
crazy.
Possible. It is against everything we believe about quantum field theory and modern physics, but it's a free country. Knock yourself out. Believe it. But don't just say that you think it's possible. That's wimpy, and that's not fair. Change the equation. Tell me exactly how you were going to change this equation. What are the terms that kick in?
I mean, some people have tried to do that when they write down like equations of quantum mechanics that allow for consciousness to play some role. Like, for example, Kelvin McQueen and Chalmers and Miguel Sebastian. have tried to write papers on this. So, people have tried to do this. Whether it's successful or not, I don't know. But that's not the strategy that the panpsychist typically takes. That's an interactive dualist strategy.
Particle accelerator. Do they violate energy conservation? Do they conserve unitarity? Do they obey some dynamical equation? How does the non-locality come in there? I want to know. And I want to know whether it's compatible with all the other experimental evidence we have. And let me give you a hint for the young people in the audience.
It's not.
If you really believe this, you would drop everything right now and devote yourself to finding what those unknown terms are. Because if you correctly come up with a theory that explains how electrons behave differently in brains than at the Large Hadron Collider, you would instantly become the most famous scientist in all of human history. Not only would you win the Nobel Prize, they would quit giving out Nobel Prizes after you won yours. There's no point in giving out any more. And yet, there's not a lot of people trying to do this.
He is funny.
It makes you wonder whether they are really committed to believing that this is the right way to go. Also, if you did it, Uri Geller would be very, very happy to think that his brain could go out there and bend the spoon. The other option, of course, I think this is the way Philip leads, but he'll let you know, not changing the core theory.
Yeah.
I kind of like this option because then I can stop listening. Then I don't really need to have any interaction with that person anymore. Why should I care if you have, this great, great theory, and I say, what does it do to my understanding of the physical world? You say, nothing. Okay, well, then maybe I have other ways to spend my time. As it says on the slide, unlike regular people, philosophers don't all think that consciousness affects behavior. This was a startling revelation when it really sank into me. They've invented this idea called the zombie, the philosophical zombie. They say,
okay, so now we're getting to it. So exactly. So not everybody likes the zombies. Most philosophers think they're at least conceptually possible. Whether or not they think they're actually possible. The most traditional response, I'd say, is the type B physicalist response, which says you can conceive of zombies conceptually. You can make sense of there being a creature just like us without consciousness. But it's impossible. You can't actually, in reality, make a creature like us without consciousness, because making a creature like us will necessitate, given the laws of physics are the same, will necessitate that there's conscious, according to type B physicalism. It's like building a world like ours and putting H2O in there, and you're going to get water. That's just the way the physics works. You put those things there, and that's what water is. So the type B physicalist says, well, yeah, you build brains in the right way, and then that's what consciousness is. So you're going to have consciousness there. So that's great. Not all philosophers agree that you can really separate consciousness from function in this way. Many of them think it's just an epistemic thing, and that we shouldn't really take that too seriously. But you're right, for the philosophers who really think that this is ideally conceivable, that really is possible, that nature could have gone this way, that nature could have produced beings just like us without consciousness, then I think you start to have some of these worries, some of these issues. So let's see. You see what he's going to say. So if your theory of consciousness is one that doesn't make any difference to the way the physical world behaves, then it's not a real thing, or not something we should take seriously. Or I think, well, anyway. So let's let him finish.
Anti-physicalists. They're trying to come up with an argument against physicalism. So they say, I bet I can conceive of a creature, maybe not in our world, but maybe in some other possible world, similar to ours but also different, that is exactly the same.
It's not similar to ours but also different. It's identical to ours, except for the fact that there's consciousness. So in that way, different, but other than that, no.
Basically and exactly the same behaviorally as a person, but who does not experience consciousness.
Yeah.
Does not really have those qualia we talked about, does not really appreciate the redness of red. So I love this argument. It's so good, because if you buy it, you've completely undermined your anti-physicalist case. If you think that zombies are conceivable, you are granting that what you mean by consciousness is something that has no effect whatsoever on human behavior. I think that consciousness has something to do with pain and love and anxiety and things like that, but not the zombie people. They've admitted that can't be true, because they could imagine a person that behaved in exactly the same way without consciousness. There would be a zombie Philip Goff who would write books about panpsychism and give impassioned speeches about the primacy of consciousness, but without ever having experienced consciousness. You have to believe that that is possible if you believe that zombies are conceivable, which completely...
No, you have to believe that that is possible if you think that zombies are possible. You don't have to believe that's possible if you think zombies are conceivable. You have to believe that is conceptually not contradictory. And even though it might actually be contradictory, the question of conceivability is one of the concepts. So many philosophers think the concepts of involving consciousness don't have any relation to function, You could put pressure on that by, people imagine inversion scenarios, like what if your red was my yellow or whatever. But it's harder to do with pain. What if your pain was my pleasure? There, people struggle. I mean, the real diehards say, yeah, I can imagine that. I can conceive of you having the experience of pleasure every time you act as though you're in pain and vice versa. But it's really hard to keep that straight. So now, of course, these kind of non-physicalists don't think that consciousness doesn't do anything. For example, it has to do with our knowledge. Somehow the phenomenal concepts that we have, according to them, involve this kind of consciousness. So zombies would lack knowledge, even though they behaved as though they had knowledge. And I think Philip's actual line on this is that since consciousness is like identical to the microphysical properties, that consciousness is going to have whatever causal powers the brain has, because Philip wants to assert an identity between the conscious qualities and the physical states themselves. That's what consciousness is on his view, at these fundamental levels. So the brain's going to have some causal powers, but what the brain really is built out of consciousness, so to speak. So consciousness has causal powers. Conceiving of zombies does put some pressure on this claim, because you could say, okay, well, if it has this role, then how is this other world going on? And I think their response is, well, just imagining a very weird world where like the things are caused in a strange way. There's like causal gaps, like the thing which causes it doesn't cause it there. There's some other weird thing going on. But why would that show that it doesn't work here, that it's not doing the job here, that we think that it's doing, because it's not doing the job there? And this is something I brought up a long time ago when I was talking about quantum mechanics and Chalmers's view on it. And I was arguing that if you have a zombie world, the laws of physics are different there, because that consciousness doesn't collapse the wave function. So if our world is one where there is collapse of the wave function by consciousness, then in the zombie world, there's no consciousness. So what's collapsing the wave function if in reality it's consciousness? The answer is nothing. So therefore, the laws of physics would have to be different. They wouldn't involve this collapse postulate involving the conscious observer. And Chalmers responded to me by saying, no, it would be the same laws of physics. There would just be weird gaps in the laws of physics, and sort of some kind of magic stuff would happen, but it would be the same. And that does get hard to make sense of when you really drill down on it. So I can see why the frustration is here, but I don't think that this argument really succeeds in showing that zombies are an argument for physicalism. I think that if you admit that zombies are possible, then you have to endorse their conclusion in some way and look for a way out of this argument. So I don't think you can just do what Sean is doing and say, yeah, these things are really possible, but that just proves physicalism. That I don't think works.
It undermines the whole argument that you're trying to make. Why would you believe that consciousness is fundamental? Philip told you, because you have private data. You have introspected and you've thought about things. The zombie thought experiment proves, if you think that zombies are conceivable, that such introspection is entirely unreliable. Because
it doesn't. This is such a bad move on the part of people who claim to understand this stuff. So the zombies would lack knowledge. They don't have knowledge. They think they do, but they don't. So when I say I feel pain, I know that I'm in pain because I have the pain experience and I'm directly experiencing it. The zombie says I feel pain, and they don't know they're in pain because they're not directly experiencing it. They falsely believe they're in pain. The pain is not there. So there is a real difference, and it explains the asymmetry between me and the zombie. I have something the zombie doesn't. So even though it doesn't, now of course you have to give a theory of knowledge that doesn't involve causal powers and blah, blah, blah. And they have that, or they try to, that's what their theory of acquaintance and all that stuff is. I'm not saying I endorse it. I'm just saying that this is not a charitable account. It's not a good argument. I don't think you've completely undermined. People say this, Dennis has been saying this for years. Conceiving of zombies doesn't undermine anything. It's just, whether they're really conceivable or not, whether it's really possible, I have my doubts, I have arguments against that, but I don't think this one succeeds. If you conceive of a zombie and you're successful, then you're conceiving of a creature identical to us, but which doesn't have consciousness. By the way, my own view is that when you do that, you're conceiving a creature very similar to us without consciousness. But because we don't know all the physical facts, we might be leaving some details out, and that's affecting what's going on in your hypothetical scenario. Okay, so, but I don't think you've undermined yourself by saying that these zombies are conceivable, and therefore you have to think that you yourself are a zombie, because there's something that I can grab. My experience on the red is right in front of me. So I don't buy this line of arguments, and I wish people would be more sophisticated about this stuff 40 years after all this shit went down. Excuse me.
Zombie would swear that it has those inner experiences.
Of course a zombie would.
So
Big fucking deal.
Completely
So
unbelievable. The punchline being that if your theory doesn't account for behavior, then in my world, it doesn't explain consciousness at all. In my world, what I want to explain about consciousness is very, very much tied up with behavior. Consciousness were different, behavior would be different. So if you
so by the way, this is, when in my youth, when I was like a closeted dualist, what kind of broke me out of that, and why I've been friendly to physicalism for so long, is thinking about this. Like, well, how does consciousness causally interact with our world? If it's a brain state, then it's just brain states interacting with the world, which we can tell a story about. If it's some non-physical thing, well, how does it do it? So yes, I think mental causation has always been a strong driver for why people like physicalism. It's defeatable, I think. It's not a knockdown argument, but it's very strong.
Theory that just gives you kind of a warm feeling about consciousness, but doesn't actually affect any way in which we act in the world, I become less interested. So
it still could be true, even if you're less interested.
The first line is, physical reality is enough. I absolutely believe that consciousness is a subtle and difficult, complex phenomenon. We don't understand much about it yet. I do not think that, well, since we haven't understood it yet, we should dramatically change our picture of the whole universe. It might take decades, centuries, millennia before we fully understand consciousness. But that's completely compatible with everything we know about the physical nature of reality. It's more productive to work within that paradigm. Thank you.
Okay, so that was a bit disappointing. I don't really think there was much there that was exciting or new. So definitely no Love Boat cruise. But anyway, so and I don't really think that this is an argument for physicalism. I think this is just more of your standard old, like, zombies are weird. But if zombies are weird, then that just means consciousness is weird if you think you can conceive of zombies. So I don't really buy this argument. I guess I'll come back and look at the debate between them. I know there's some. How much longer is there? There's, quite a bit of this left. So they must have some interaction between the two. And maybe I'll come back and check that out. But for right now, I think that's quite a bit enough. Somewhat underwhelming, but cool.